which many of you will be familiar with. And along with our sister movement, the Fridays for Future school strike movement, we use nonviolent direct action to try to spur action on the climate and ecological crisis. So I'm going to talk about the history of those groups and their principles and how they operate a bit a little later. And I'm also going to talk about like some of the arguments that we use when we're meeting with people like MPs and boards and media people to try to get them to come around on the issue of the climate crisis. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about how the pandemic has kind of changed everything in some bad ways and some good ways in terms of getting action on the climate crisis. But to start off, I wanted to make a little note about the unity of these movements right now, because of course the movement around the climate crisis is, seeing a lot of action and growth right now at the very last minute. And we're also seeing a lot of action around other movements, such as Black Lives Matter, such as Indigenous rights movements, particularly here in Canada. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the unity of these movements. It's something that many of you probably already familiar with, and that many folks in the movements kind of recognize that we're allies and that these movements are interconnected. But I think it's good just to make it a little more explicit as to why they're interconnected, what the underlying thread is there. And so, yeah, we hear people say, like, you can't have climate justice without social justice. And what that means is like that the climate crisis and the social justice crises are both symptoms of the same underlying crisis. And I might call it the crisis of inequality. And some kind of frame this as capitalism. And I think it goes a lot deeper than that and a lot older than that. Capitalism is maybe the new main form that it takes, but it's taken many other forms and gone by many other names. But basically what we're talking about is these binary systems of domination, where one group establishes itself as a privileged group and just dominates another group and takes from them. And this has been going on since almost the beginning of, since the beginning of history and before, I'm sure. And we see these binaries popping up again and again. Settler over indigenous, white over people of color, male over female, cishet over LGBTQ+, the ultra wealthy over everyone else. And we also have these binaries like man over nature, old over young, and present generations over future generations. And I think there we really start to see that link that we're all fighting the same thing. We can call it the inequality crisis as a whole, but we're not just fighting one form of predation or supremacy, but we're actually fighting the structure of supremacy, the idea that people should do this at all. I mean, really, with all of our technology and our science and what we know now, I would think our species would have grown beyond this behavior, or I would hope, but we certainly haven't. So this is kind of the underlying struggle that we're all a part of, and this is why we really try to be good allies to the other folks who are suffering under these systems and fighting them as well. Now, the last time I saw Marion, I was in Halifax for the AGM of Extinction Rebellion Nova Scotia, and I was giving a nonviolent direct action workshop. And this is where we kind of train people to resist nonviolently and to remain calm and not respond with anger or violence in the face of all of that, and train them on other things, tactics and preparation and what happens when you go to jail and all this sort of thing. And so I've given a lot of those trainings over the past year and a half or so. I've given a lot of talks on the climate crisis and on the principles of Extinction Rebellion. And I've also met with MPs, MLAs. We've met with board members of Nova Scotia Power. We've met with Energy Department officials. And we try to get them to understand the urgency, and not only to understand it, but to act on it, which is really the key thing. That's going to be the hardest thing to get, that we really need to get. And so we try to persuade them, and I remind them that like 5 or 10 years from now, this will all be too late. Whatever we do then will kind of be too late. We will have blown past our one chance to avert societal collapse and human extinction. What we do right now matters maybe more than any other time in human history. All of the accomplishments of our civilization, plentiful food, education, and the internet, modern medicine, it could all just be wiped out, uh, gone from the face of the earth because of our most fatal flaw as a species, and that is our inability to rein in this predatory class, this predatory behavior that seeks ever more profits and status and control at the expense of the lives and livelihoods of everyone else. Now, this fatal flaw has been running amok for thousands of years. We can look back to the brutality of the really early empires like the Assyrian Empire. We can look at more modern manifestations like colonialism, racism. Excuse me here. You have to kind of excuse me because I have a bit of a sniffle. We've been tested. It's not COVID, but I'm a little today. And my home country is also dealing with a lot of stuff. And I've been on the phones for like 2 weeks straight, trying to help my home country get through whatever it's going through right now. So I'm a little discombobulated. But you know, it's all coming to a head right now. For decades, the fossil fuel industry, really for 50 years, they've known about the crisis, and they could have easily shifted to renewables and still made a ton of money and still been fabulously wealthy, but they chose not to. Instead, they lied, they hid what was happening, they used their billions to promote denial and subvert any kind of efforts by regular folks to deal with this. And so now it's already too late for quite a lot. It's too late to stop the 6th mass extinction. We've blown past that point. We're hemorrhaging hundreds of species a day, but it isn't too late to salvage most of the Earth's life if we act now. It's too late to guarantee future generations a livable planet. We've actually blown past that point, maybe sometime in the 80s or 90s. You know, we blew past it with very little fanfare or public debate of any kind. Now, when we talk about taking action, we're only talking about probabilities. When they're talking about the Paris Agreement, they're talking about giving the next generation a 50% or a 70% chance of a viable future based on certain models. We're no longer even talking about guaranteeing it. We've given up on that. But if we act now, it's not too late to give the next generation their best shot at a livable planet. And you know, they might have a decent shot if we actually do what we need to do now. So what does it mean to do what we need to do now? Well, one thing it means is that targets like net zero GHG emissions by 2050 are way too late. That is nowhere near good enough. We have to make a just transition to safe energy as quickly as humanly possible. There are countries like Costa Rica and Iceland that are planning to do this within a few years. And Canada is one of the wealthiest countries in the world with the most resources. We can definitely do that too if we have the will, if we have the political will to do it. And most critically, it means that these decisions are way too big for any one government or one party to be in control of. So we want to get those out of political hands and put them in the hands of the public and the scientists. And I'll talk a little more about XR demands in a minute and what our specific demands are, how we do that. Yes, so in short, what we're talking about is what now is being called a just recovery. A little earlier it was being called a Green New Deal or a fair transition. You see a lot of words for it. But basically it means we have to get onto a fair, just system as quickly as possible. Now in Nova Scotia, that's going to have a lot of very particular implications. It's going to mean things like we can't do the Alton Gas project. This project was given an environmental permit that didn't take climate change into account at all back in 2013 or 2014 or something. It hasn't been reviewed. They're still allowed to operate under that permit. They're spending millions and millions of dollars on new fossil fuel infrastructure now in 2020. They're doing it over the objections of local indigenous groups in Sibechinegedi. And those folks are going to be the ones that are dealing with the fallout from all of the degradation of the environment that's resulting from it. You know, that's just one example. We can talk about the gold mining. The current government is actively trying to get corporations to come here and put in gold mines, which do just massive destruction to the local environment. And the real kicker is society doesn't need any more gold mines. We have all the gold we need for a very long time. It's in vaults or it's in jewelry, but you know, we do use gold for industry for some legitimate purposes, but we've got more than enough for that in those vaults. We don't need to mine any more gold. It's just profits for people who are already very wealthy. That's all it's about. So we see these heartbreaking things going on. I'm sure a lot of you are very concerned about the clear cutting, the glyphosate spraying, and all of this going on. We have a blockade going on right now in the southern part of Nova Scotia to protect mainland moose. I'm sure many of you are aware of. One more thing I would point out, just in the Nova Scotia context, is these coal plants. We have 6 fossil fuel plants that are still operating. And the current plan is to let those operate for decades more. This is a special deal that Nova Scotia Power and the provincial government made with the federal government called the Equalization Agreement. They're going to be operating years and years after the rest of Canada shut all theirs down. And it's mainly about the shareholders in Nova Scotia Power want to get their full return on investment for that. So their needs of making people who are probably very wealthy a little bit more wealthier are being put ahead of the entire rest of the planet. So these are the kind of things going on, and these are the kind of things that we're trying to draw attention to. At the Canadian level, of course, a fair transition would mean no more pipelines, and that we have to do immediately a well-managed and rapid and just transition to safe energy. Right now, we're having an unmanaged transition, and it's being blocked, it's being slowed down, it's being slow-walked by the decision makers in power. And it's the little folks, the regular folks, who are being hurt by this. Just a week or two ago, Exxon announced it's laying off over 10,000 people in Calgary. And this is because of an unmanaged transition. If we had had a managed transition, Exxon would have been nationalized a long time ago, shut down, wound up, or shifted to renewables, and those folks would have been taken care of. They would have had severance, they would have had supports to get them into their next job in the new economy, training, and all of that. But instead, they're being left out in the cold. Because our decision makers are insisting on a slow-walked and unmanaged transition. So we have the whole world now sitting at a crossroads. And Canada here, we're a leading economy, and we have one of the highest carbon footprints per capita in the world. And so the whole world is watching for our lead. For decades, the world has been putting the profits of the predatory class over regular people in the planet. So for Canada to lead, we have to find the courage to reverse all of that. Not some of it, not a little bit here and there, not gradually. We have to reverse all of it as soon as possible. We have to enact a just recovery or a Green New Deal for everyone. And we have to embrace our only hope, which means making a future where people and planet always come first, not where they're a consideration, not where they have a voice at the table, where they're always the #1 consideration. So those are the arguments that we use. That's what I tell these folks when we're trying to convince them that what they're doing is just, perhaps one of the most unethical things that anyone's done in history. But the deciders and the policymakers and the men, yes, almost always men, who roam the halls of power, they're only going to be spurred to act when the public pressure outweighs the pull of the fossil lobbyists and their allied interests. And so that's where the need for groups like Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future comes in. That is why nonviolent direct action is so necessary. For decades, the environmental movement has been doing petitions, we've been flyering, we've been holding marches, and just none of it's worked. They've ignored it all. Carbon emissions are still going up. With the pandemic, I'm not sure if the jury's out this year. Maybe we'll see a leveling off. I'm not sure. But up until the pandemic, they were going up every single year and continue to. So that's why these groups kind of started up. Now I'm going to give you a little breakdown of the history of the groups. In the fall of 2018, Fridays for Future got started. It's basically kind of centered around one person. Greta Thunberg she's a Swedish high school student from Stockholm. And she got so fed up with the way the world is going that she decided every Friday, I'm going to sit outside the Swedish parliament with my sign. Her sign says School strike for klimatet, school strike for climate. And I'm just not going to go to school. And she sat there alone by herself for a few weeks. And finally, a reporter decided he would come interview her and see what she's about. And that interview kind of spurred a lot more activity and interest. And she got more interviews, and pretty soon other students were joining her. And after a while, it became quite huge. It started spreading to other cities. And she started touring and speaking at these other cities. And many of you will know, roughly 1 year ago in Montreal, she was here for our school strike for climate in Canada. The one in Montreal got 500,000 people. The one in Halifax on that same day got 10,000, which was the largest action of any kind in modern history in Halifax, I assume in Nova Scotia, maybe in Atlantic Canada. So, just an amazing movement she started. And she goes to the UN and speaks to world leaders and tells them in very blunt, plain language to their face, what they're doing and what they need to do. And right around the same time, Extinction Rebellion also began. It's a bit different. It's a leaderless movement. It has a lot of co-founders, but it doesn't have any leaders. It mainly started around the London area, but quickly spread. It's in over 100 countries in all the continents except Antarctica, although I'm sure the penguins agree with us. It's built around a set of demands and principles. So if you adhere to the demands, if you agree with the demands and if you adhere to the principles of XR, then you are a full member of XR as much as anyone else. You have every right to speak on behalf of XR as much as anyone else does. There's no one that can tell you you're wrong or that you shouldn't be doing that because there's no leaders. It's decentralized, non-hierarchical organization. That's one thing that attracts a lot of folks to it. I'll briefly go over the 3 demands. Sometimes they're broken into 4 demands, but they're roughly all the same. The 2 systems are roughly the same. The first demand is that our decision makers tell the truth about the climate crisis, and the hashtag is tell the truth. So we've seen some progress on that. We have seen several countries declare a climate emergency, officially acknowledge that the climate crisis is an emergency. Haven't seen a lot of action yet, but we have gotten that demand met in some ways, not as much as we'd like. The second demand is to act now on the crisis, and the hashtag is act now. And so this would mean going ahead and doing that just transition immediately. That's what acting now means. And specifically, the demand of XR is to get to net zero GHG emissions by 2025. That's a very ambitious target, but we think it's commensurate with the crisis we're facing and the consequences we're asking young people and future generations to accept for our comfort. The third demand is to go beyond politics, and that's the hashtag beyond politics. And so that gets to what I was talking about earlier about taking this out of political hands and letting the public and the experts decide on how the transition will go. So the specific mechanism for that Extinction Rebellion advocates is called a citizens' assembly. And this has been done a few times in the past, including in Canada, for specific issues in different provinces. What it is basically a giant jury. You get 100 citizens selected at random, and you bring them together, and then they are advised by experts, not by lobbyists, not by politicians, but by experts like scientists. And another key component is you must have representation and voices from marginalized groups, indigenous groups, African and Nova Scotians in our case, and transitioning workers. The people who have been getting the short end of the stick in the past and who are likely to get it in the future if we don't include their voices. So this is all part of the transition to climate and social justice, and how I was mentioning before about how those are inseparable. So that is our third demand. Sometimes it's broken up into 4th to make it explicit that this has to be a socially just transition. Sometimes they're both described as the third demand, but I think everyone's pretty much on board with the content. The principles of XR, I'll go through some of them really quickly. There's about 10 or 12. If you're interested in learning more, you can always go to rebellion.earth, and you can learn all about XR there in the principles in more detail. I already mentioned there's no leaders and we're decentralized. That's a very important principle. Nonviolence is another principle, and that's not just a moral consideration, that's also tactical and strategic. One of the co-founders was a sociologist who had studied the history of social movements that affected rapid social change. And he found that nonviolent movements were twice as successful as violent ones. So that's why we advocate a nonviolent approach. I'm not going to judge, people who are groups of people who are oppressed and not privileged and maybe don't have the option of nonviolence, who have been violent sometimes. I'm not judging that. but XR advocates nonviolence as their approach. We accept everyone and every part of everyone, and we don't do any blaming or shaming. So the reason I want to mention that is, you know, we're not all vegan. We don't all have solar panels on our homes and electric cars. You know, we're all kind of, most folks who are involved in this are kind of chipping away in their life bit by bit, getting a bamboo toothbrush here and cutting out more meat there and trying to get more sustainable in our individual lifestyles. But that's not really where the battle is. The battle is really with the big levers. If we all did everything perfectly in our individual lives, the Earth would still go off a cliff if our energy system is running on 70% fossil fuels. So we need our big decision makers in politics, in the corporate world, in the media to get on board with this, or it's all for naught. So we don't focus on regular folks and what they're doing so much, although of course it's always great, do as much as you can, we're all working on it. But we don't blame and shame each other for this and that. That's an important principle. Yeah, so XR has had huge success. The first really big action kicked off in London about a year and a half ago. The Spring Rebellion in 2019. They shut down 6 different key choke points around London, different squares and bridges, with just people sitting in the bridge or in the square in the intersection and refusing to get up. Some of them were using lock-on devices and that sort of thing. You know, it has to be fun and festive too. There were parties, there was music, there was food, there were bands. Massive Attack played one of these. Radiohead donated a whole bunch of proceeds from one of their albums to XR. REM as well, little name dropping. But, you know, so the police would come in and clear the intersection. They would arrest everyone and put them all in jail, and more people would get in the intersection and sit down, and they would start arresting them too. And the jails were filling up. And when the jails got full, they had to start letting people go, and they would let those people go. But people were still coming into the intersections, into the bridges. They could not clear them. And that went on for a week and a half, and they couldn't clear them for a week and a half. And at the end of all of that, the far right UK government under Boris Johnson, who is effectively like their Trump or Jason Kinney or whoever, their government not only declared a climate emergency, they also agreed to a net zero emissions by 2050, which of course is not anywhere near good enough. But just to compare, the Green Party in Canada, their target is net zero emissions by 2050. So, you know, that's quite a huge accomplishment. I don't mean to pick on the Green Party. Some of the details of their plan are better than Boris Johnson's, and they do have the best plan of any major party in Canada right now, although there's not a lot of difference. We hope to see a lot of movement in general, get that 2050 down a lot in the future. That's a little bit of an aside. But that was a hugely successful action, and that's been replicated in places all over the world. In Nova Scotia, just give you a little rundown of some of the actions we've done and how the different ones have shaken out in terms of their success. And just to highlight how effective the arrests and the nonviolent direct action are. Our very first action was in February of 2019, and we had to change it to a Sunday because there was a horrible storm on the Saturday. So we were blocking intersections in downtown Halifax on Sunday in February, and you know, Halifax is kind of dead on Sundays, even downtown. So the police didn't care. They kind of blocked off the roads around us and just let us sit there. They didn't even arrest us. So there were no arrests on that action, and we got 4 articles in the media on that action, which is not bad. We're getting our word out, you know, and it fired a lot of folks up. We had about 60 people come out. Now, the next action was the one that Marion was talking about that started at the Armdale Rotary, and we marched blocking traffic up, what's the name of the street? Connaught Street, all the way across Halifax down to Nova Scotia Power on the waterfront, where we kind of surrounded their building and, you know, insisted that they, you know, meet with us. And we also, in the words of the Chronicle Herald, besieged their building and the CBC building. And they agreed to meet with us. We met with their board. We met with the board, met with one member of the CBC board, and we met with members of the Nova Scotia Power Board. The Chronicle Herald agreed to start using the term climate crisis instead of climate change, and they agreed to increase their coverage, which they did some, We still don't feel like they're really covering it like the emergency it is, but that we had some movement there. The CBC, acknowledged us, agreed with us, and made some big promises. And we didn't have, I guess, the resources to follow up with them much yet. Nova Scotia Power acknowledged the climate crisis as an emergency, which we thought was pretty big. We didn't expect them to do that going in. That was one of our asks. And then they kind of deflected to the government saying, we're following the laws and the government is telling us what to do and all that. So kind of playing the shell game with us from that point on. But we had 4 arrests at that action. And that action with 4 arrests got us 16 articles in the media compared to just 4 with the first action with no arrests. So we kind of get an idea of how effective that is.
Patrick, I'm giving you a time check.
Okay.
It's almost 7:45. We usually end about 8 or a little after. So if you want to leave time for questions.
Okay, I can wrap up in 7 minutes and leave 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
That work?
Perfect.
Oh, yeah, I hope I'm not getting too into the weeds here. Quick rundown. In March, we disrupted the legislature. 5 of us went in and shouted our slogans during question period, and we were escorted out by security. What else? We blocked the Prime Minister's motorcade when he came here in May. 2 of us were arrested. That resulted in all of the articles about his visit to Nova Scotia, him having to share his headline with Extinction Rebellion and the message, our messaging appearing in all of his articles there. So that was a pretty big success. I could mention several more actions. I'll just wrap it up with the bridge out action, which was really the big one. And this was coordinated with 4 or 5 different XR groups all across Canada, where we blocked major bridges in Vancouver, Edmonton, Toronto. There's a couple others in there, and Halifax, the McDonald Bridge. And when we did that, we announced it a week in advance, just to make sure regular folks knew this was not directed at them, so they had plenty of time to make other arrangements, and so they didn't have to, so they weren't like blocked in their commute. But because we announced it a week in advance, there was a media storm, and we were getting interview requests every single day about this. And I don't even know how many articles came out about it. It was on the front page of the Herald. I was interviewed in studio for television for CTV Atlantic, and that aired in all 4 Atlantic provinces. People saw that in Labrador, for all I know. And then after the action, we did an hour-long radio call-in show with Sheldon McLeod, where me and Jillian, who some of you may know, people were calling in asking us questions.
And did you know that you made the front page of the Anglican newspaper, the Diocesan Times, on that? Okay. You got a full article, full page on that.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's great. Oh, well, thank you for that, if you had anything to do with that. Yeah, so 5 minutes. Yeah, real quickly. So the reason we do nonviolent direct action, first, it shuts down business as usual, and that's uncomfortable for the authorities, of course. But mainly it's the communications game. It's about winning the hearts and minds of the public. And it's about that sacrificial nature of the arrest. When the general public sees someone that maybe looks a lot like them, that they identify with, getting arrested, they think, oh my goodness, why? What's going on? What is this? And then they hear what's going on and why we're doing it. And hopefully they think, well, of course, that's totally reasonable. Why are they arresting them? Why don't they just do that? And if everything goes right, then pretty soon the public is all on our side, and the authorities don't have a leg left to stand on. And so a lot of this is about shifting what's called the Overton window. And that's something psychologists talk about. That's the range of acceptable things that you can say in public. So we want to get to the point where it's no longer acceptable for any politician to suggest that we continue using fossil fuels, that's okay to do that to the next generation. So a lot of it's about making a cultural shift. I could tell a story here. I'm just going to skip ahead, and I'm going to talk about the pandemic and how that's affected things. First of all, we should keep in mind that the pandemic is not a separate crisis. It's a sub-crisis of the climate crisis. Scientists have been telling us for a long time, when we go in destroying habitats, that puts us into contact with new diseases, but it also crashes those ecosystems and opportunistic species come in, like rats and bats. And those things are also disease vectors. So they've been telling us we should expect more pandemics because of the climate crisis. So it's a sub-crisis here. One effect of the pandemic was a lot got canceled. A lot of strikes and actions were going to be planned for April and May, and they got canceled. So there was a little bit of loss of momentum in some senses. some people who are very involved in the movement, suddenly their lockdown lives did not allow them to use their hours for volunteering. They may have had young children who are suddenly at home while they're trying to work, and they're juggling that. So that affected the movement a bit. Some new folks, hopefully, and some new folks are in fact coming in and picking up the slack there, and maybe some of you are some of those new folks. But two things that it has done. There were two cards that politicians and decision makers used to play to kind of shut down any talk of a transition, and they don't really have those anymore. The first card is to say, oh, we are listening to the science. We're already doing that, but now with the pandemic, we see what it really looks like to listen to the science on a crisis. With the pandemic, we saw Justin Trudeau and Stephen McNeil both sit down every single day and talk to the public with the top scientists, the top medical officer right next to them, and say, this is an emergency. We're going to do everything this person says because it's an emergency. We have to listen to the science. And even if it turns our society upside down, even if it's really hard, we're going to do it because this is serious. And in the climate movement, a lot of people were like, how in the world did they do that? How did that happen? Because we've been trying to get them to do that for decades on the climate crisis, and they just won't. But with the pandemic, they did. But the one thing it is, now they can't say they can't do that. They've just shown everyone that they can respond to a crisis like that. And the second thing is about turning the society upside down to deal with the crisis. That's exactly what we did with the pandemic. We shut everything down. It was really painful for everyone. But we provided supports. We made it work. We provided CERB. People, Canada did, and all countries should have, provided these supports to people to make sure they were okay. They could have been better, and I'm not saying they were perfect, but it went a long way. It was the right thing to do, even if it wasn't perfect. So we see that when there's a pandemic and when old privileged white people are under threat, like with this pandemic, they can turn society upside down. So they don't have that argument anymore that we can't do that. And so now we need to really raise those voices in the climate movement and say, now you need to do that for the vulnerable young people who are facing the same kind of threat by the climate crisis. You need to turn society upside down for them as well. Okay, 7:50. I'll leave it at that. And in conclusion, I was going to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to Marion. Thank you all for your attention. I encourage everyone to get involved with social and or climate justice. I'm sure many of you already are. And show up at events. Consider doing nonviolent direct action. There's a lot of free trainings, including online by XR. And support our allies in our allied movements and show solidarity there. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Now there's a little bit of time for questions. We usually do it. Take your mics off and we'll see who wants to ask a question.
Or make a comment.
I just want to say it's not a Ruth, but also you're probably aware, Patrick, we have a Facebook and we've got a website. We do have most of your actions, I think, on the Facebook page, but it's always good to make sure we know what you're wanting us to do. All right, so Jeanette and then Ruth.
Thanks. Patrick, one thing I'm wondering about these days is the role of politics. In theory, I love the idea of just saying that we'll work with anybody and trying to sway any politician. But it doesn't seem to be working that way. And when I look at what's happening in New Zealand, for example, with the Prime Minister and changes seems to be happening, I wonder, should we put some energy into supporting a political party and shaping that political party?
That's definitely another tool in the toolkit. That's not something that XR as a group really gets into in order to kind of keep ourselves separate from who we're going to need to be, going up against. The thing with XR, there isn't any political party that has their climate promises anywhere near in line with our demands at the moment. So we would be pressuring all of them right now. For example, in the UK during their uprising in the spring of 2019, some people went in and glued themselves to Jeremy Corbyn's backyard. And he was by far the most progressive political leader in the UK at the time that was in a party that had any chance of getting power. But his policies were not in line with XR demands. So we want to shift everybody way to the pragmatic position on climate change, including Greens here, NDP, and all the other parties. That would be the XR stance. Now, I myself, I just spent 2 weeks on the phones for a politician who I really don't agree with on a lot of things, just because I felt like it was a matter of democracy was going to go down the drain in my home country. You guys can guess which country that is. But, you know, so that I wasn't doing that in the context of XR, obviously. But yeah, that's definitely a tack that I think is worth exploring. And if people can get into parties like, you know, the Liberal Party's having a leadership contest. And if anyone is a member of that party, it's definitely a great time to put loads of pressure on them. Ian Rankin just announced his recovery plan. It includes doubling the climate targets. He wants to get us to, I think, 80% renewables by 2030. You know, it's kind of hard coming from him because he's been like the clear-cut king. So it's like, what changed all of a sudden? How can we trust you? I don't know. I don't want to get too much into that. But yes, getting in there and pressuring political parties in every way, I think is also great, outside the context of XR, but also great.
Ruth.
Okay, so Patrick, thank you very much for your clear introduction to the philosophy of the Extinction Rebellion. I just had one quick follow-up question. I noticed you talked about managed transition. I was wondering if you could explain what you mean by managed transition and what in particular that means for us here in Nova Scotia in terms of what individuals can do.
Okay, yeah, I guess I'm contrasting that because a lot of folks have accepted that the transition is happening one way or the other, just market forces and everything. We see oil companies crashing, laying off people. BP is selling their London headquarters right now. You know, some, I think Ulstead, maybe a Danish energy company.
Zoom conference right now.
Marianne, you might want to mute yourself.
Oh, sorry.
Then you can talk. Oh.
So that's one example. This Danish energy company has announced they're switching completely to renewables, whereas they were a big oil company before. So I think we're seeing the transition happening one way or the other. But the thing is, the politicians aren't managing it. They aren't getting in there and saying, you know, using all of these levers that they have to, you know, maybe force those companies to do it as quickly as they should, to provide supports for the workers, Green New Deal packages or just recovery packages for the workers to make sure they're not left out in the cold, to make sure marginalized groups aren't left out in the cold. So I guess, I mean, a managed transition would mean that our politicians are actively helping the transition instead of like slow walking it and thwarting it and trying to stop it.
I'll ask the question. What can you tell us of how you see the next few months? Not, I mean, in terms of your activism.
Oh, that's a good question. Honestly, I have not been as active over the past few months as I had previously.
I know. We all thought we'd be on marches, but it's not that way. So I'm not sure. I mean, we know you're there and you're doing stuff.
Oh, well, XR folks are active. We have this wonderful blockade going on down in the South Shore right now, near Keji, I think.
Yeah.
And Nina Newington is really spearheading that whole thing. I haven't been as active. I've, you know, youngish kids, and the lockdown has created a lot of new restraints on my time. So me personally, I don't know. With XR, I know, you know, anyone who wants to get involved in XR and start doing actions to make their own little affinity group, which is like a small cell that does actions on its own, they're welcome to do that at any time. And we expect to see people cropping up and doing that. I would think that we're going to have something in the works for the next time, maybe in the spring, something big, or if the legislature is ever going to meet again. They're supposed to meet by law by sometime in November, and they haven't even announced it yet. So maybe there will be something around that. But I don't really have any more to say about that at the moment.
Thank you.
Because it seems to, oh, sorry, Barb, you go ahead.
What is
Oh,
it?
yeah, sorry. I just wanted to build on what you had been saying. I have found that in my personal experience, as the climate deteriorates and there is more pressure put on society, so job losses, healthcare system, in tatters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People have less to give, less willingness to tackle other problems such as the climate. It feels like with the pandemic, people are going into survival mode, and there is much less willingness to even explore the solutions that we've been so close to and should are so long in the making that should have been the progress has just been so stalled. My concern is that, as it was mentioned earlier, people raising children are already busy just leading their lives, going to work every day, et cetera, et cetera. How does this bode for the future? I mean, I can just see that as the societal problems mount, we are just going to be in a deeper crisis, and it really requires political will, but that requires pressure by ordinary people. And I'm wondering how do you keep people motivated to continue the fight, because it's a big one?
That's a great question. Thank you. XR does have kind of an answer for that, and I didn't touch on it, but it's one of the main principles of XR, and it's called regenerative culture. And so that's kind of designed to prevent burnout and keep everyone in a community. And it can look like just hosting different events, teaching each other how to do, grow food, or teaching each other the skills that we're going to need when the societal collapse comes in whatever form and whatever extreme it takes. And making those connections in the community and building like a resilient community that can withstand that and support each other through that. And that can also, of course, do actions and participate in actions to try to get our decision makers to act to stop it. So there's a whole component around that I didn't really have time to get into, but I would encourage you to check it out at rebellion.earth and look at the regenerative culture models. I think they're quite impressive.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
If I might say, I think that fits in quite well, Patrick and Barb, with the approach that, somewhere along the line, as a community of faith, we thought, what is our real role in all of this? Where do we fit in this? We don't have to come up with the science. We have the science before us, and we can, direct people to the science that will help them better understand the climate crisis. But one of the things that we recognized fairly early in the game was that people could feel a real despair and a real grief over the loss that we're experiencing with the climate crisis. And it can either cause paralysis, or I think this regenerative program can provide some of the hope. So what we provided in the past is like retreats and that kind of support that would help people kind of ground themselves so that they're not feeling burnt out, they're not feeling the despair. But Nancy's a psychologist, and her forte is echo grief. And so we're actually looking at an echo grief support group in the new year. Next week she's talking about it, as a matter of fact. And so that becomes one of the things that we might be able to offer to this mix that might be able to help. Because if you're right, Patrick, if we don't, taking action gives hope, it gives energy, it helps people feel like they're able to make a contribution. But in order to do that, you have to come out of that frozen feeling too. So, and Nancy, do you want to add to that?
No, it's funny. You were thinking
What? Oh, Nancy, you're freezing.
community garden.
You're freezing.
Oh shoot, because am I frozen?
There, you're good now.
Okay, you were thinking eco-grief. No, it's a question of working with this with a couple other people about the elements, because we see people, we've talked about this several months ago. We see people, they understand that they need to go to the beach, they need to go to the trails, they need to get out in nature. They don't understand they have to take care of it. You know, that they're responsible. People don't make that logical connection. So somewhere in there and mixing up grief. So we're just kind of starting to develop this, or I'm taking it deeper, because there's a lot of psychological points to this. But I also was thinking, it's funny because as Patrick was talking about teaching people the skills, I was thinking of community gardens, because that's one of the themes that we've been doing. Gardening is something, most of us are gardeners. And a lot of us have been gardeners for a very long time. And so every once in a while we have gardening sessions talking about community gardens and also individual gardens, because I remember that was one of the big learnings I did last year. Is I thought everybody knew how to garden, they just didn't do it. And then I learned, no, people don't know how to garden. So I think what you're doing in terms of building skills, and the whole gardening might be something that we would interconnect it sometimes, because any gardeners love to talk gardening. Yeah.
One of the other things that we're based on the premise that if you love the earth, you're more likely to care for and about it.
Yeah.
And so actually everybody here is welcome to the opening of the Hope and Inspiration Art Show tomorrow night at 6 o'clock.
I want to, we'll have to close
It's
up. I always
6 to
give
5.
Marion the last word, but I want to say, Patrick, this was
Johanna wants to
really,
speak.
am I frozen again? No.
Johanna wants to say something.
Oh, let me
Is it
finish,
six-
Johanna,
is it
because I'm in the
6 or-
middle of thought. Oh, sorry,
2
go ahead.
seconds. Is it 6 or 5,
6.
Marion? 6?
Six,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you for giving us a really, really good outline. I really appreciate that. It gives me a better context to put the actions in, and yeah. I appreciate what you said about social movements with nonviolence, because that is proven it works better. Violence just begets violence. So, Marion, I'll give you the final word. Unless, Patrick, do you want a final word?
No,
No.
all I really want to say is thank you. And Patrick, you know, we try to promote and advertise the actions, and as much as we possibly can, feel free to post those things on our Facebook page. Feel free to ask us once we're, you know, if we ever are back, if we ever achieve the new normal, the better normal, then post-pandemic, you know, we'll open our buildings again to you. But, you know, there's a variety of things that I'm sure we can do to support, because that's one of the things that we're really called to do.
Thanks, Marion. Patrick, you want the last word?
Oh, no, it was great to hear all of the questions and all of your input. And I think it was a great conversation. And you know, let us know about that eco-grief circle if that's getting going. I assume that'll be on Zoom.
Yeah,
We'll put it on our page too, because there have been people here in Antigonish who've been saying, oh, we're going to get something like that going, and then it just never happened. So that's something that's been on a lot of folks' minds, and we'll be very happy to share that.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, no, we'll start that in January, the new year.
Oh, great.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Indoor
Bye.
bench chairs
Great.
Thanks,
gardening.
Patrick.
Really good.
Thanks for a really
Thank you,
great
Patrick.
session. Thank you.
Good.